With a background of sky-high inflation, geopolitical uncertainty with war in Ukraine, and a housing market scorched by record home prices, Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's unveiled her second budget. Will it help you? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. This is the first budget after the Liberals and NDP announced their supply and confidence agreement, which would see them prop up the government until 2025. Now, in terms of new spending, this budget comes with much less than previous ones as COVID support programs come to an end. There's just over $31 billion over the next 5 years of new spending. And this budget will also see the deficit drop to $52 billion, down half from last year's forecast. Now, that windfall comes in the form of higher oil prices and revenues. And while the country has more than made up for lost jobs that evaporated during the pandemic, some money minds were looking for future growth. Our Unpublished.vote question asked you, does the 2022 federal budget address your economic concerns? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now at Unpublished.vote. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll take a look at the numbers with economist Jim Stanford, the director of the Center for Future Work. As well, we'll get the view from small business with Dan Kelly, president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. But first, I am pleased to be joined by Warren Kinsella, political commentator, former special advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chretien. And Warren, is this an NDP budget?
Yeah, it is. It is as I like to call it, it's the axis of weasels. It was, if it looks to you like it was something cooked up in a Trotskyite back room, it kind of is like that. And it just seems to be blissfully ignorant, Ed, of the realities that Joe and Jane Front Porch are grappling with today, which, as you pointed out, is inflation, which is at a 30-year high. You've got COVID on a rampage again. In Ontario, we're being told that as many as 120,000 people are getting sick every single day. And then you've got a war in Ukraine, one of our closest allies. We've got the biggest Ukrainian diaspora in the world here in Canada. And on all of those standards, on each one of them, and we can certainly talk about it, I think that the budget was a failure. Was it as much of a failure as people expected? Perhaps not. But I think on the key things that people are preoccupied with right now, it was.
So that in terms of preoccupation is obviously inflation. Now, a lot of the revenue the government's getting is from obviously higher gas prices and fuel prices. If you could sort of curb back on the carbon tax like you were suggesting in your last column, do you not lose a bit of that revenue?
I'll be fair to Trudeau. There is no question he had a carbon tax in his 2015 platform. He was elected on that platform. He repeated his vow to have a carbon tax in 2019. He was reelected with a minority. It's gone all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, as we both know. And the Supreme Court of Canada said he had the constitutional and legal authority to do it. So I believe he can do it. The point that I was making, and I think a lot of other people are making, is, a few days ago when he raised it, on April the 1st, it was just the wrong time to do it. Yes, you have the authority to do it. You've got a democratic result that says you can do it, but you shouldn't do it now when we're looking at inflation at a 30-year high. And P.S., Ed, he did it on the day that MPs and members of cabinet gave themselves a massive raise. It was just the optics, the look was all bad. And, that's why I think that, doing the carbon tax right now is not a prudent or a fair thing to do to Canadians.
In terms of inflation and rising prices, of course, Canada's housing market is still out of control. But is a tax-free savings account for a down payment going to be enough to get more people into the market?
No, it's not. And, he's got a renovation program there. They've got this savings program. They've got a tax credit. They've got more housing programs than I think there is housing stock available in Canada. And there's no question, we have one of the lowest amounts of houses available for people to buy in the G7. And, my kids, as you and I have talked about before, all four of them, they were raised in Toronto and they've left. My daughter said to me, Dad, I'm never going to be able to afford to buy a house in Toronto or a condo. And she's right. So, the government needed to do something about that. As to whether these programs that they cooked up will have any meaningful effect, I don't think so, because the issue really is the one you pointed out a few minutes ago, which is interest rates. As long as interest rates are as low as they are, It's fostering this overheated housing market, but it's also contributing to inflation.
Affordable housing has always been a key issue in the country, and the new housing accelerator fund for municipalities aims to create more housing, but that's a provincial responsibility, is it not?
It is. And whenever I hear a government talking about cutting red tape, it's like, oh, they're going to create an office that will create more red tape to cut red tape. Like, we're entitled, I think, to be skeptical about some of these things. And in fairness to Freeland, or to Prime Minister Singh, as I like to now call him, like they can only meaningfully do a bit. For example, inflation is a global phenomenon. President Biden's grappling with it, Prime Minister Johnson, everybody's dealing with inflation at the present time. But the question is, like if you look back to the days when my gang was running things in '94, that first Chretien budget, where we were facing a lot of the same things Trudeau is. Our debt to GDP ratio was terrible. We'd been downgraded by the credit rating agencies. We were seen as kind of a basket case economically. A lot of the same criticisms are being directed at Trudeau, but the qualitative difference is he doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. And he's got the tools to do something about it right now, because as you pointed out, he's actually in a better budgetary position in 2022 than Chretien was in 1994.
Bay Street's not happy with the budget, particularly about the potential for growth as it's dwindling here in Canada. But the deficit, on the other hand, will dramatically drop next year. How do you sort of counter the two of those?
Well, I guess my answer is 1.2 trillion. That's what the debt is going to be, the national debt. And we need to account for that at some point as well. Like at the point where Chretien took power in '94, sorry to keep going back to that, but that's the point of comparison I've got, is in '94, as you will recall, we had a debt to GDP ratio of about 67%. Like we were an economic basket case. Trudeau is not in as bad a position. He's definitely benefited from lower interest rates. The low interest rates that we pay for our houses and our cars and whatnot and loans, Trudeau's also benefiting from that. But he was in a position to deal with this. He had said to us in 2015, I vow, it's in stone, I am going to balance the budget by 2019, when he was in a position to do that before the pandemic, and he didn't. And now, of course, we're in a much worse position. We all know that rates are going to go up, and that's going to have, for example, what Trudeau is now paying to service the debt is more than our entire defense commitment, which, by the way, the budget didn't meet yesterday either. 2016, Obama came, the guy behind me here, and spoke to Parliament and said, NATO needs more Canada. And everybody in Canada nodded their heads. And we still haven't met our NATO commitment, even with this terrible genocidal war taking place in Ukraine.
And that's where I was going to go next. Ukraine, obviously top of mind. Defense got $8 billion over 5 years, but does not put it anywhere near that percentage. But I'm wondering, this war's been going on for about a month now, and when it comes to building a budget, that's a long-term project. How do you deal with something that sort of gets thrown into the mix when you're just trying to put everything together at the end?
Well, because the criticism has been made for some time, and in fairness to Trudeau, Harper didn't meet the 2% commitment either. But we live in a more dangerous world. Like this conflict that's taking place in Ukraine, it's not just taking place in Ukraine, it's taking place in Europe. Right? That's where Canadians go to have vacations, and we've got the largest Ukrainian population outside of Russia and Ukraine here in Canada. So we have an ethical but also a strategic obligation to pay attention to this conflict. And even Ed, with all of that, Freeland and Trudeau and Singh still couldn't bring themselves to meet that piddling commitment of 2% of GDP. Yes, she spent more, but she didn't spend enough. And, that is an ongoing thing. That's not something that just is required as a consequence of Ukraine. It's something that we should have done years ago.
Warren, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Warren Kinsella is a political commentator and former special advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chretien. When it came to this budget, all eyes were on the cooperation agreement between the Liberals and the NDP. Jim Stanford's an economist and the director of the Center for Future Work, and he joins us now. And Jim, do you feel the government broke the bank in terms of spending with this budget?
No, I don't think so, Ed. The dollar figures allocated to the new programs that came along with that confidence and supply agreement with the NDP are actually pretty small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. The most concrete measure from that deal was the dental care program, rolling out over 5 years, starting with kids under 12. And that whole thing is $5 billion over 5 years. So think about a budget of 400 and some billion in total, and deficits that were enormous during the pandemic, and that will not fundamentally affect the fiscal trajectory. In fact, the deficit is much smaller than was expected even just a few months ago, thanks to the very strong economic growth numbers we're seeing. So I think politically that agreement was very significant, but you don't really see its footprint all over this budget.
In terms of the dental care plan, how is that going to benefit the economy?
Oh, I think it'll be very useful in a number of ways. Think about payroll costs for employers. You typically have dental as one of the major employment-related benefits. Now, a lot of Canadians don't get those benefits with their jobs. Probably half, in fact, have jobs that would not offer that sort of basic supplementary health benefit. So for them, they're not necessarily getting the dental care, or they have to pay it out of pocket. And you have a situation where a lot of low-income people can't do that. So then what happens? They get rotten teeth and infections, and it ends up costing more money down the road. So as basic dollars and cents prevention, this makes sense. But from the payroll cost perspective, if this kind of expands and we end up with a situation where across the board, your basic dental care is covered for most people through a public system, that will be a very significant saving for employers in the long run. So, that's not going to happen overnight. This is being phased in. But in economic terms, we already know, Ed, that our Medicare system is a huge competitive advantage in Canada. For employers here versus, say, the US, they save billions because we've got a public healthcare system, and the same logic applies to dental care.
We don't have a national pharmacare program, though. That was one of the I guess the deals between the two parties, or health transfers. We didn't see any extra money for health. Are you surprised about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the pharmacare thing, we've been talking about pharmacare, and even before the deal with the NDP, of course, the Liberals were indicating, in fact, for some years, their interest in it, but it just hasn't unfolded yet. I think partly because of the need to negotiate with the provinces around a thing like that. We've seen with the national childcare agreement, how tricky those provincial negotiations can be, and perhaps the government just didn't want to, bite off another whole process like that. For pharmacare. On the other hand, it is in the agreement. There's words in the budget about moving forward and more, exploration and development of the proposal. So I would hope that they get more concrete on that. On the health transfers to the provinces, we live in a federal system, and whining between the provinces and the federal government is kind of a national sport. And we've seen that happening big time in the months leading up to this budget. But the reality is the provincial budgets are in much better shape than anyone thought they would have been a year or two ago as well. We've already got some provinces balancing the budgets despite the pandemic. So I think the cry that the provinces need special help somehow didn't quite resonate. So there's obviously huge transfers being paid under the existing systems, but there was no big change in those frameworks in yesterday's budget.
One of the other targets of this budget was the sky-high prices of housing in Canada, in particular for first-time buyers. And is a tax-free savings account going to be enough for these people, or do they need more help?
Oh gosh, I think they budgeted $750 million as the total fiscal contribution through those tax-free first home buyer savings accounts, or whatever the heck the acronym for that one is going to be. And that is absolutely small potatoes in the overall housing market. We've seen a 30% run up in housing prices since the pandemic, and hundreds of billions of dollars at stake there. So I see that thing as more optics than anything else, to be frank. I don't think that's going to make a significant difference to housing affordability. I was more impressed with the direct money that the government committed to constructing low cost and non-market housing. We've seen now the federal government say that the housing co-op sector is going to be an important part of making housing more affordable. And remember, a co-op is where it's not privately owned. You live in it, you pay towards it, you're a member, but you don't have your house as a speculative asset to sell. I used to live in a housing co-op, and they're great, but we haven't been doing this for the last couple decades. And now Ottawa is seeing the housing co-ops as one of many measures to try and increase the supply of more affordable or non-market housing. I think that'll be much more important in the long run.
In terms of housing as well, they plan a 2-year ban on foreign ownership. If there's so few people from outside this country buying, is it really going to do that much?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Ed, but it also applied to foreign companies that are buying investment properties in Canada. So, that could be more significant. I'm based in Vancouver, and they were one of the first jurisdictions in Canada in BC to try and bring down a limit on foreign purchases. And it did make a bit of a difference. It didn't stop the whole bandwagon of rising housing prices. That was more driven by very low interest rates. And remember, that's going to turn around too. The Bank of Canada is already increasing interest rates. They're expected to increase them a lot more in the next little bit. So, it's painful, but that will do more for housing affordability, frankly, than anything else, at least in terms of the property price piece of it. It means your mortgage is more expensive, but the housing price per se is definitely going to come down. And I think the foreign ban will make a difference. I think it will make an incremental difference.
Okay, you're in Vancouver. You said is that a huge market for foreign buyers?
Oh yeah, it was until the BC government brought in some limits on foreign ownership. They've also complemented that with vacancy taxes, so that you have to pay reasonably significant amount if you own a property that no one's living in. And in Vancouver, particularly, there was an awful lot of both individual and investor interest from overseas in the housing here. And Vancouver's market under this provision has cooled off a bit relative to some of the other kind of bubble situations that we see elsewhere in Canada.
Growth seems to be lacking, according to economists. Is there somewhere the government could have gone to help spur that on here?
I'm curious by that. I've heard that refrain from some of the bank economists and business people and so on. It just isn't true. The reason the government's budget looks so good is precisely because growth has been so strong. And we're doing more than just rebounding from the pandemic. Like, we did rebound from the pandemic, and that was a fast rebound, and that was great. But we're above and beyond that now. And the numbers are stunning. In the fourth quarter of 2021, this is the most recent macro data that we've got, Canada's economy in nominal GDP terms was growing at an annualized rate of 13%. And, this is astounding. And this is what is just driving billions and billions and billions of dollars into federal and provincial coffers. And that's the main reason why the deficits are disappearing without the sort of austerity that we experienced in previous deficit reduction exercises. So it is just not true. We've got a new labor force number out just this week from Statistics Canada in the wake of the budget. Unemployment's down to 5.3%, 73,000 jobs created. So the economy is growing. Now, there are things that we could do to make quality jobs and quality growth, including, I think, productivity, paying attention to productivity and innovation, investment, that kind of thing. And there are a few items in the budget on those types of topics. But it is precisely because the Canadian economy is just going on all cylinders that the government had so much money to spend, including for this dental plan and other initiatives, yet the deficit came in $30 billion smaller than they thought it was going to be in November. So this is a marvelous situation. This is a marvelous time, in a way, to be a finance minister.
Jim, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Jim Stanford is an economist and the director for the Center for Future Work. Now, small business is the engine of the economy, as many will attribute. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business is the voice of small business in this country, and Dan Kelly is the president, and he joins us now. And Dan, as CFIB was a little disappointed, there was nothing for the members in this federal budget. What were you looking for?
Well, we were hoping for an awful lot more. There were a few small things, some tax changes that I think are going to be beneficial for some small businesses, but overall, it truly was quite disappointing. For one thing, there's a lot of businesses that are just now starting to dig themselves out of COVID, but all of the COVID support programs have ended, and even the program that was designated to help businesses recover from COVID has been taken away. Small firms right now are dealing with massive new cost increases, some made worse by changes in Ottawa in recent weeks, and there was no relief there either. So we've got this scenario where a lot of revenues are not back to where they were pre-COVID. Costs are dramatically higher than they were pre-COVID. That's not good math for a business that might be sitting on $160,000 worth of fresh debt that they've taken on just to survive over the last 2 years.
Was the CFIB looking for some of these programs to continue for a while, or, if we're coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, look, I mean, with businesses being reopened, we're not surprised that many of the subsidy programs have ended, the wage subsidy, rent subsidies, and they're in their new names. But I got to tell you, the program that I was surprised that wasn't extended was the Canada Recovery Hiring Program. This was a program it was launched in the fall of last year and designed to help small firms rebuild their workforce as they came out of the COVID emergency series of layoffs and shutdowns. That program never saw the light of day because we were perpetually in wave after wave of COVID. Now that businesses are open and bringing back their staff, this is the time when that program would be super useful for, starting basically from March, but it's ending beginning of May. So we had urged the federal government to at least keep that program alive to help small firms bring back some of their workers, and it has ended too. The other thing that would have been a big help that didn't happen is forgiving some of the COVID-related debt. As I said, $160,000 is the average that small firms have gone into the hole trying to keep their lights on. $60,000 of that is in a government CEBA loan, the Canada Emergency Business Account loan. The government has said $20,000 of that will be forgivable if the balance is repaid. We've asked for that to be moved up to $30,000 or 50% forgivable. That didn't happen either.
You brought up hiring, and when we look at the job creation in Canada right now, we've made back all the jobs we lost during the pandemic. What I'm trying to figure out, I think a lot of people are, is why are your members having difficulty finding help?
Yeah, for one thing, yes, I think if you look at the headline economic numbers across Canada, things don't look too bad. Unemployment rate being low, economic growth being higher. That's not always true, though, when you look at the small firms that were hardest hit by the pandemic. If you look at retail, hospitality, the service sector, arts and entertainment businesses, these businesses where social distancing, physical distancing was required through most of the pandemic, lockdowns were the longest. They are the ones that are struggling the most to get back their staff. Many people obviously have moved on to large companies and governments. Small firms have been left with very limited staff, in some cases because somebody that worked in a restaurant says, well, I've been locked down 5 times. I can't keep doing this. And so they've moved to other sectors. That's not the business's fault. No. That was as a result of the government policy. So what we've urged the government to do is to find ways to help small firms hire. And that was that hiring incentive that didn't get extended. But secondly, the feds did, to their credit, make some big changes to the temporary foreign worker program right now. And it's going to allow a lot more flexibility to small firms to use temporary workers, at least in the short term, to try to supplement the labor force. This is a big deal in resort communities where there's just nobody available to keep a hotel or resort open as we move into the summer. So the feds did that prior to the budget, right prior to the budget. That was a good move. The other change that we did like was they expanded access to the small business corporate tax rate for some more larger capital intensive small businesses. So a farm or a car dealership, they might have lost access to that lower 9% small business corporate tax rate because their capital exceeded the $15 million threshold. That's now been moved up to $50 million. So more small and medium-sized firms will be able to take advantage of that. That was a good move from Ottawa too.
One thing that the CFIB was looking for was, or at least something to address, was credit card fees, but no progress. Is that a government issue or is that a credit card company issue?
It's both, but I will say credit cards, of course, many people, all people, I think, changed the way that they pay during the pandemic. There were lots of stores that were no longer taking cash during the pandemic. So the use of credit cards went sky high during the pandemic. And many consumers don't know that the merchant pays a big fee whenever they use their credit card. And if you use your card online, the merchant pays an even higher fee for that. So there's been windfall revenues to the banks and the credit card processing companies, Visa, MasterCard, et cetera, as a result of all of these changes. But small merchants have been paying a fortune. The federal government, the current Liberals, promised in 2019 to lower these credit card processing fees. In 2021, in their budget, they said that they were going to lower credit card processing fees. And guess what? It's 2022, and they've said we're going to consult on lowering credit card processing fees. Well, that's just kicking that ball forward year after year. Small firms are facing, in addition to their limited revenue, they're facing rapid increases in all of their costs, and that relief on the credit card processing side would have provided some help to small firms. Ottawa did find the time, though, to increase bank special profit taxes that go to Ottawa. So they found time to do that. They didn't find time to follow through on their commitment to lower the processing fees that ultimately go to the banks as well.
Dan, I want to thank you for joining us.
Anytime, Ed.
Dan Kelly is the president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Our unpublished .vote question asks, does the 2022 federal budget address your economic concerns? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. I want to thank our guest today on the Unpublished Cafe, political commentator Warren Kinsella, economist Jim Stanford, and Dan Kelly of the CFIB. And I want to thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.